Welcome to the Rare Earth Exchanges podcast, where power, politics, and the world's most coveted materials collide. Rare earth elements power the backbone of tomorrow's most critical technologies. With China dominating global production, the U.S. and its allies must align strategically to ensure a stable future. This urgency prompted tech entrepreneurs Daniel O'Connor and Dustin Olsen to launch Rare Earth Exchanges, a news and insight platform built to equip stakeholders and decision makers with the tools and intelligence needed to reduce dependency and build prosperous resilience. Let's get into it.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Rare Earth Exchanges podcast. I'm your host, Dustin, joined by my co-host, Daniel. And today our special guest is a repeat guest, Melissa Sanderson. Melissa, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, guys.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here. So you were on the show back in February, and we really loved that conversation. And today we'd love to keep it going. So to start, can you give us an update on how things have been going with American Rare Earths in the last 6 months or so?
With great pleasure, because it's a good news story. I am going to start with people, because to me, people are the foundation upon which all success is built. And we have a dynamic CEO named Mark Wall. And Mark has been using his industry experience and connections to assemble a really strong, highly productive team of professionals. So together, those folks have been really advancing our project. Case in point, Mark made a strategic decision that instead of us investing directly in both time and money in building our own pilot plant, it would be more advantageous to us to find a partner to cooperate with. And that is why we are working with the Saskatchewan Research Council, SRC, to do that pilot plant work for us to produce our oxide, to demonstrate that we indeed have a functional flow sheet that does produce highly important oxide concentrate. So that's one example. Another example is that Mark has focused a lot of attention on preparing our company to enter NASDAQ by the end of this year. And those preparations include ensuring that the PFS will be finalized in no later than the third quarter. Also, that we managed to get through all of the legal and regulatory hurdles, because there are a lot of steps that are required to essentially transform a non-NASDAQ listed company, in our case from the ASX, to U.S. standards. So part of that process also involves people. We've added a new board member to highly experienced mining guy who is also the CEO of a uranium company right here in Casper, Wyoming. So we Casperites are multiplying our presence on the board, shall we say. We also have an important partnership with a company in Casper that is working on elements of our processing chain. And our partnerships with the University of Wyoming and with the Western Research Institute continue to flourish and grow as well. So all of these elements taken together have resulted in big progress. All of that progress, I would say, on the technical side, stems from important discoveries that our lead geologist, Phoebe Fuker, made that demonstrated the very unique nature of the Red Mountain allanite Pluton. Because I remember, I've been on the board now for going on 6 years, and I remember when I first joined the board, the common reaction that I would get from professionals in the rare earth space when I started to talk about the company was, oh, wait a minute, isn't that allanite? Isn't that hard rock allanite? You're never going to crack that. Nobody's ever cracked allanite. Well, turns out, at least if you have this wonderfully very specific sort of allanite that we do, yes, it can be cracked. And that was how, working with Tetra Tech, we managed to come up with our viable flow sheet, which demonstrably does work and uses only conventional and proven technology. So all of this taken together is why I say it's very exciting times. The last 6 months have gone by in a real blur as everything has just begun to really hit its stride.
Wow. A lot has happened in 6 months, which is awesome to hear. And honestly, no surprise. This industry is heating up in great ways, and everyone is really busy and seeing a lot of doors open that haven't been able to be opened in a number of years. So that's awesome to hear all that.
Thank you. We're pretty pleased.
Yeah, you should be. So there's a lot I want to get into, but I did want to just highlight that you said you guys want to go public at the end of Q3 or Q4. What is that looking?
We want to have a NASDAQ listing by the end of this year.
Gotcha. That's fantastic.
So I wanted to just jump in. Congratulations, Mel. I think it's amazing the progress that the company has been making. Particularly notable is what this I believe a PhD student working with you has been able to uncover. And maybe just for the general lay audience, like, why is allanite considered difficult? What has, at a high level been the breakthrough that opens up these new opportunities geologically and from a mining perspective? Like, a little bit more on that would be interesting for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you already know, there's essentially three sort of host elements for the majority of rare earths. And they vary in complexity in terms of being able to extract the rare earths. So in a certain way, monazite sands are the simplest because after all, it's embedded in the word sand. And of course, China has a lot of monazite sands. There's some really exciting and interesting sand deposits in places like Brazil. Then we have the ionic clays, a step harder than the sands, but still, proven separation methodologies exist. And then there's hard rock, because you can find rare earth not only partnered with allanite, but other forms of rare earth as well. What makes it difficult, number one, is, again, in the name, hard rock. Right away, just as in the copper industry, you're looking at a depository nature that is saying to you, you're going to have to crush and grind me in order to even begin to get into what I'm holding inside. So right away, a certain processing methodology path suggests itself. The historical problem has been, once you begin to crush and grind hard rock, you've also ground down your rare earths to a point where it's very hard to separate those out in commercial quantities. Now, what makes our particular allanite unique, as Phoebe discovered, by the way, I just have to tell you quickly about Phoebe. She's actually English, and all the way over there in God's Green Island, she had begun to study the Red Mountain Pluton of Wyoming, because working with her professor there at the master's degree level, she became convinced that for a whole host of geological reasons that I'm not competent to explain, that Pluton was likely to be a much more fractured crystalline structure than most allanite is. And that was why she didn't know about us at the time. That was why she decided to come to the University of Wyoming to do her doctoral thesis. And we hired her initially as an intern to work with our then geological staff, and specifically on defining the nature of the Red Mountain Pluton. As her research progressed and the materials were tested, her theory was verified. The Red Mountain Pluton has a uniquely fractured crystalline structure that allows the rare earths to be readily separated because they're not tightly enclosed in the solid crystal. The crystal has already been fractured. So that, in the layman's way of my understanding of it, is what makes our allanite unique and has made it possible for us to develop this processing and separation methodology completely based on existing technology. So I said at the beginning, people are foundational. Phoebe's a great example of that, because without Phoebe, would we have gotten there? Maybe. Maybe not. So it's a good example of how one person really can play a key role in a company.
100%, Mel. I think that's fascinating. It's definitely something that we will follow up with and write about, when appropriate, because it's an exciting story, and people love to hear about breakthroughs when it comes to geology, and whether it's new deposits or new ways to access a very important critical material. That's very, very exciting. We know that you've also received several $1 million from the state, which has been instrumental, I believe, in helping with some of the housekeeping type matters, permitting and things like that. The company's done a good job, from our assessment, of building an ecosystem of stakeholders that are absolutely required for success. There's also an EXIM Bank note or loan, is there not?
It's a letter of interest, LOI.
Okay. Letter of interest. So an LOI that exhibits the government's interest in supporting the company in its endeavors. Would that be a fair way to summarize?
Yeah, let's start with that EXIM LOI, because I would say that what that really represents is a leading edge recognition of the strategic value of the Halleck Creek deposit, which is, by the way, the largest currently known deposit in North America. And that LOI, we received that a couple of years ago based on our scoping study, which was highly unusual, that a government agency would make a commitment, even in the form of an LOI, based solely on a scoping study. So that to me is where the important signal lies. I mean, obviously, it's wonderful to potentially be able to access $456 million to support the project. That's thrilling, don't get me wrong. But it really was a validation that this truly is a strategic asset for America, because honest to goodness, we get this into full production, we can satisfy America's demand for rare earths for literally hundreds of years. So through potential evolutions of technology, through the spread, for instance, of robots and data centers and space satellites and space weapons and space ships, all of these things are going to continue to grow and represent important demand elements for rare earths. And we're going to be best positioned to be a continuous source of reliable, secure supply for all of these crucial industrial aspects. So EXIM was very forward-looking in that regard. Likewise, the state of Wyoming, that $7.1 million grant was a real force magnifier for us, because like all junior companies, we're always cash strapped, and getting through that process, that transformation from exploration to development, you have to jump through so many regulatory and legal hurdles. It is permitting, environmental permitting, water permitting, air, migratory animal studies. All of these things cost money, just as does the exploratory drilling to better determine the nature of our deposit. And I'm going to come back to that one in a second, because there's exciting discoveries in that little bundle there too. So being able to have that $7.1 million grant, doubling essentially our existing resources, has also been a major contributing factor to the acceleration of this project, as I mentioned. Just touching briefly on what I said is exciting news about the composition of the deposit. So we already knew from very early on that we have the neodymium and praseodymium lights. As we progressed with our exploration program, we defined very significant quantities of the heavy rares, which are very crucial and much rarer in this rarer space. You guys, you hear that phrase all the time. Well, rare earth isn't rare anyway. Well, yes and no, because light rare deposits, we've got quite a few of those. However, light rare deposits that are accompanied by heavy rares become a lot scarcer. And when you put on top of that Our most recent discoveries regarding the quantities of both samarium and yttrium that we have at Halleck Creek makes that deposit truly exceptional in its composition as well as its size. So again, exciting news. And we've been working with the University of Wyoming, specifically the School of Energy Resources, but other elements out there as well. Phoebe, of course, is from UW. We've been working with other institutions, and it's a good time to be Mark Wall. Let's put it that way, because it's a good time to be a CEO when the good news is rolling in.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Absolutely.
Look, when we looked at your project, we saw a number of risk factors early on. Okay, and I'll just bear with me. One is complex, the mineralogy and the metallurgy, the associated metallurgy that your resource flow would identify, right? One is the processing and separation. One is all the environmental permitting that you have to go through in the United States. And one would be the intense capital requirements. Now, what's really exciting is that you all are systematically addressing these factors. Now, separation is not trivial. We have identified it as the number one bottleneck that outside of China, any country faces. Okay, and we've seen SBC, partner with a few different groups. Okay, because they've obviously been developing their separation methodologies, technologies, and it's based on. Maybe talk a little bit about that. It is based on the same approach that they're doing in China, correct? The solvent extraction.
Yes, that's the fundamental basis. Yeah. In that way, rare earth is very similar to copper, that it relies on crush, grind, and solvent extraction as three key steps in the initial part of the processing and separation chain. Yeah, 100%.
So it sounds like, so if we say, the ability based on the breakthrough of Phoebe to have an economical source, I think we're heading in that direction. Number one. Number two, we've found a separation partner that's really been in the market and proven itself now. Number three, working with the state, we're basically transcending any kind of environmental permitting challenges. And number four, through the EXIM loan, you have the potential to really start exponentially raising the capital needed. What would you say for the company now is the biggest risk factor? And we have a lot of investors that come to rare earth exchanges. So we see the huge potential. This is one of the largest deposits in North America you're sitting on. What would you say is the number one risk factor at this point that investors should be looking at as we start to focus on your company, American Rare Earth in Wyoming?
It's interesting because I would say that the biggest challenge for ARR, and actually, to be fair, for every company in this space, is capital. It's capital attraction, capital retention, capital mobilization. We're in a space that is historically unattractive because of the long lead time return on investment. And there's no way to change that. It takes time to build a mine. Even if you have a facilitating environment like we do here in Wyoming. Wyoming is a mining friendly state. That there's broad social support, which is key for mining. There's broad political support for our mine in particular. People want this project to be built. Its significance is well understood in Wyoming. So that's a huge plus for us. And the fact that we're able to build our first phase, the Cowboy State Mine, exclusively on state of Wyoming land, has been a huge market advantage for us. Because instead of the 10 to 15 years that permitting might have taken, we're able to do that in a matter of 3 to 5 years maximum. So that by itself is a huge distinguishing factor for us. Nonetheless, capital attraction and retention remains a problem. how to get the story out, because people in general, as I started to say, in the United States, have not been attracted to the mining industry. It is a long-term proposition because the fact is, even when you enter production, so in our case, we're anticipating being in production by 2031. But even when a mine enters production, there's still a period of a certain amount of years, depending on what the financing stack is, before the mine actually begins to pay back. And that has always distracted investors. And the other factor that we've historically been up against is, unlike people in Wyoming, most Americans are not pro-mining. So if you are managing someone's investment portfolio and you say to that person, I think that American Rare Earths would be a great asset to have in the portfolio, and your client says, American Rare Earths, what does that do? What's a mining company? No. I don't want mining companies in my portfolio. I don't believe in mining companies. So there's problems embedded in the financial structure in the United States that make it hard, even for a company like ours that has so many positive factors going for it, to attract money. Now, of course, inevitably that leads us to say, well, under this administration in particular, but even in the prior administration, the U.S. government was beginning to try to step into that financial gap, and through a variety of mechanisms, trying to provide a sense of security around mining investments in order to induce the private sector to open the coffers and the checkbooks. Now, I would say that those programs have not yet been in place long enough to be fulsomely evaluated, but certainly it has changed the dynamic of how mining companies look for financing. Even as recently as 5 years ago, I don't think there were a lot of CEOs out there who were saying to themselves or to their boards, hey, as a base for our financial stack, we need government financing. And that just wasn't in the viewpoint. Now, in most cases, it's regarded as a highly crucial element. Get some government financing in as foundation, and then continue to build out from that using the various tools at our disposal. So it's a long way of saying it, but the biggest risk to us at this moment is being able to attract the capital necessary to continue this accelerated process that we're on. Because could we move even faster? Sure, potentially we could. If we had access to more financing, because we've now got the hard problems licked, as you were pointing out. We've got the right people in place, as I was mentioning. And, we could really rock and roll, but money's a problem.
Well, on that note, Mel, we have really coined a term called Great Powers Era 2.0. And we believe that we've moved into a different era in globalization, and supply chains are fundamental, especially critical minerals and rare earths. And every country is now going to try to go up the value chain, which means it's going to get a whole lot more expensive for China as well. If this theory is correct, and it's a thesis we've put out there, your asset becomes extremely valuable, right? Because there's only so many of these. There's only so many of these that can actually produce yield, right? So the value proposition is potentially staggering if you can keep moving down the pathway towards commercialization, right? Dustin, thoughts on this so far? Any questions based on what you've been seeing and hearing?
No, I think it's been really interesting. But Mel, I would like because we're talking about financing and needing other people. You're also co-chair of the Critical Minerals Institute, and you interface with the policy community. Are you seeing any gaps there? Are you also having roadblocks from a policy front in addition to the financing?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Dustin, because it gives me a chance to speak to the problem of knowledge. Because again, I mean, yes, we have experts in different pockets in the government. In the Department of Commerce, for instance, there are experts in areas such as fluorite and manganese, and of course copper, etc. But rare earths is such a relatively new phenomenon in terms of high priority development within the industry that inside of the government, there's just not a lot of experts on what a good rare earth project looks like. We don't have 100 years of experience like the copper industry does to be able to point at and say, here's the leading indicators for success, because it's all relatively new. So that's where organizations like CMI are trying to play a role, because we are an international organization that encompasses some of the leading international experts on rare earths with decades of experience from working elsewhere, like Australia, for instance. And so, one of our missions is to try to help reduce that knowledge gap and help educate the decision makers on the distinguishing factors of a potentially successful project versus a project that is less likely to be economically viable. Trying to walk that line and make a solid investment of taxpayer money into the best projects possible. So yes, CMI is working in that area.
So I feel like this kind of dovetails into the CMI Summit in Toronto, where your CEO spoke about building America's rare earth powerhouse.
Absolutely.
Can you just tie or connect the dots there a little bit of what that core argument is and where you're finding the most resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. People tend to use the phrase supply chain without necessarily the accompanying mental visual. Each link is important. So the point that Mark was making at the summit is one that many companies are trying to pursue, but obviously we believe we are pursuing, to be able to provide as many links in that chain as possible. So going beyond extracting the rocks from the earth and producing a concentrate, but moving further along the chain to producing oxide that is specifically tailored to end user needs, because each end user's need is different. Semiconductor industry needs a certain composition that is distinct from a robotics producer, for instance, or a space satellite producer. Everybody needs different levels of purity, all high purity, of course, and different compositions. So that's a high chemistry set, and we are aiming to incorporate that. In an ideal world, and this is our objective, we want to have a partner that is into the business of magnet making so that we can go 3/4 of the way on our own, have a viable partner for that last link in the chain, and therefore be a secure, reliable US-based supplier from rock to magnet. That is the premise that Mark was articulating in Toronto. And it's a crucial one, because coming back to the state of the world, what we're seeing is an increasingly risky and unstable universe to work in, so to speak, where supply chains, the longer they are, the more vulnerable they are. A lesson that we all first began learning during COVID. So to the extent possible, the more elements interrelated on a supply chain that can be located within the United States, the more defensible, secure, and sustainable that chain will be. I always like to say there is no more secure supply chain than mined and made in America. And that's what American Rare Earths wants to do. And that's what a lot of companies would like to do.
So, Mel, can I add to this discussion? One of the challenges that we're seeing, again, I mentioned that many nations now are going to try to go up the value chain. Okay. Meaning there's a race right now. And the outsourcing to China of this process has solidified now a reaction. If we look at this process, one challenge that we face is the end user, the automobile industry, the drone industry, the forthcoming robotics industry. They care about price. They haven't looked at these inputs as strategic. Okay. And so now we're trying to educate these sectors too. There are viewers that come to rare earth exchanges, readers, etc., that these inputs are going to get more expensive, and they have to update their corporate economics to look at resilience, security, stability as a strategic consideration in their accounting. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I have lots of thoughts on that one. Thank you for bringing it up, Daniel. Because a lot of times the front office of a company is not getting information in a format that it needs. What do I mean by that? Looking at international supply chains right now, one of the biggest costs that are not being factored in, insurance. If you are trying to ship through the Strait of Hormuz, I can promise you that if you're able to get insured, it is astronomical. And in many cases, you cannot get insured. That's a huge cost because it's being passed through to the end users, and they're not yet putting it on their own sheets, but they're being faced with that cost. There's also the cost of failure to deliver. So your supply chain is completely interrupted. It's completely cut. It doesn't matter if it's the Straits of Hormuz, maybe it's the South China Sea next. Your supply chain is vulnerable to being cut. Now you are not able to deliver to your supplier. And there's all kinds of contractual penalties built into that, not to mention the hit to your reputation, which is also carries monetary consequences. So there's a whole array of these, what I think of as hidden costs that are not being adequately acknowledged in purchasing decisions. And let's face it, we've got a deadline coming up too, just in terms of China. The détente that was negotiated by President Trump and President Xi last autumn basically comes to an end in November. The worst case scenario is China dials back sharply on all of the taps. Now, something that a lot of people don't talk about in this intervening space of time, China has also cracked down substantially on smuggling. Chinese government pretty much always used to turn a blind eye to smuggling, which is a huge industry in China.
Yes.
They're not turning a blind eye anymore. They are closing off the rat holes. And frankly, those rat holes have been beneficial to legitimate companies in trying to maintain their supply chain integrities. So with less, let us say, gray market sources, with potentially less official sources, there's a coming crisis that is very, very real. And that is the biggest cost that those who make the purchasing decisions are not adequately valuing. When you stack when you stack all of these things up, the so-called green premium or safe premium that is loosely talked about as making Western production too expensive suddenly becomes anything but cost prohibitive.
That's right. Just on that note, we have corporate subscribers across a number of industry that we interact with. And what we're being told, exactly to your point, Mel, is that the supply chain people are figuring it out right now. They're getting panicky because they see that crunch time is around the corner. But the boards do not. The boards and the C-suite are still, they're getting sort of political timeline messages. We write about political timelines and industry timelines, and they're two very different things. So we might want we might want to rally up our nation and feel good about what we're doing with political timelines. And I think there's something to that. We have to feel good. We have to be excited. We have to ensure that capital markets are coming towards this industry. Okay. On the other hand, we have to have a way to talk about the industry timeline so that you can keep the capital flowing, to your point earlier, and you can plan and manage accordingly, the gaps that are coming. You understand the leverage vis-a-vis China. There's a disconnect there that I think, we haven't overcome yet. What's your thoughts on that?
No, there absolutely is, because, I would actually add a third timeline to that, and I would call that the quarterly timeline. So in addition to, the political timeline that boards and C-suites have to take into account, there's the quarterly timeline. Because very unfortunately, and particularly in America, the expectation of increased profit quarter over quarter has become a huge distorting factor in the ability of businesses to do business. It's an unrealistic expectation, and it needs to be taken out of the equation. And obviously, the same could be said for the political logic, because it's always very short term. Every 2 years we have legislative elections. Every 4 years we have presidential elections. Businesses who try to run their business based on those kind of timelines also have some significant issues to grapple with. Because as we know, just to build a mine, physically construct it. I mean, you've got all of your permits, blah, blah, blah. Just to physically construct it, depending on how large a facility you're making, how complex your facility is, etc., is anywhere from 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Well, right away, that doesn't fit very well into a political timetable. It certainly doesn't fit very well into a quarterly timetable. So it is a problem of education. It is a problem of, CEOs are not always comfortable having a frank discussion with the board, and definitely supply chain experts are not always comfortable having a brutally frank discussion with the CEO. It's hard to tell the truth when the truth sounds like it's all bad news all the time.
Well, it's ironic that President Trump recently, I heard him, I either read about it or heard it, even said we should get rid of the quarterly reporting system.
Yeah, he's right.
Trump said, if we're trying to reindustrialize, okay, you have to do that. You cannot. So, I have a very different take on the funding mechanisms that we're using. I do not believe it should be venture and private equity based. I think that's a mistake, right? Because there's too much profit taking that comes in. That's my opinion. That's not Rare Earth Exchange's company opinion. But I'm much more of, I want to hearken back to public financing structures like during the New Deal and things, and the Highway Act of 1957 or 56, and any number of other examples, even Operation Warp Speed during COVID. It was actually a really good idea. I have some critiques of how it was executed, but I think we're going to need something like an Operation Warp Speed. I think there's going to be many tens of billions of dollars that are yet to be spent, that are going to be spent. I do believe one of your companies is your company is going to benefit from that, because we need a diversified ecosystem for this market, right? Because again, our understanding is China has its own economic problems, overproduction crises, and they're priming the pump of demand through a number of programs that we cover. Well, guess what, Mel? Guess what those programs lead to the demand for? Rare earth elements and critical minerals.
Yeah, logically so. I would like to contribute one more thought to this line of conversation, because when you talk about sort of at the federal government level, I think what we're lacking at the federal government level is essentially a targeted investment strategy for each crucial link in the supply chain.
Elaborate on that point, a very important point you're making.
Yeah, because, at the state level, we see states that are working hard to attract the end users. So Arizona, for an example, because I know that one pretty well, was successful in attracting Taiwan Semiconductor to set up a big manufacturing facility in the state. That's a good example. Coherently, the federal government should be providing incentives and enticements for magnet makers, for more semiconductor makers, for cutting edge glass technology, data packet transmission makers. We need an industrial strategy. We don't currently have one. And that's an important weakness that we collectively need to work to overcome and utilize those tens of billions of dollars that you just mentioned in the most constructive and most enduring way possible.
Makes complete sense, Mel. Makes complete sense as I see it. Dustin.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. And in so many ways, I feel like we were able to pull back the curtain and just get to the heart of the issues that we see not only here in the United States, but around the world. And so I hope people who listen to this episode will truly find it informational and guiding in how they approach investments and other decisions that they want to make. So, Mel, thank you for being here for a round 2 conversation about what's been going on, not only with your company and CMI, but in the political realm as well. So we hope to have you back again and keep the conversation going.
Well, thank you guys. You know, I'm very happy to come back. I loved our conversation and very happy to, at your request, continue these interesting conversations.
Absolutely. We appreciate you, Mel.